Before we descend into the dark, twisty corridors of this story, please make sure to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. We explore the shadows of the Cold War every week, uncovering the secrets that were buried just beneath the surface of ordinary lives. Now, let's go to Virginia, 1989. Commander Elias Thorne, USN, retired, knew the sound of silence better than any man in Northern Virginia. For 22 years, he had lived his life inside the pressure hulls of Sturgeon-class attack submarines, hunting Soviet shadows beneath the polar ice caps. In that world, silence wasn't just the absence of noise. It was a weapon, a shield, and a religion. He could distinguish the cavitation of a screw from a biological transient, a whale or a school of shrimp, from 10 miles away. He knew the groan of steel under pressure and the distinct rhythmic thrum of a reactor coolant pump. When he retired in 1986, he bought a split-level brick house in McLean, a leafy, quiet suburb just across the river from Washington, D.C. It was the kind of neighborhood where the lawns were manicured with geometric precision, where the mailboxes were painted identical shades of matte black, and where the neighbors were polite but distant. Most of them worked for the agency in Langley, or the Pentagon, or some Beltway defense contractor. They were men who carried briefcases locked with combinations they never wrote down. Elias spent his retirement in his detached garage. It was his sanctuary, a space where the chaotic, noisy world above ground couldn't reach him. He was restoring a 1967 Austin Healey, a project that required patience and precision. But on the afternoon of October 14, 1989, it wasn't the car that held his attention. It was the floor. Elias was lying on a creeper, sliding out from under the chassis of the Healey, when he felt it. It was subtle, something an ordinary man might have dismissed as a heavy truck passing on the distant highway or the settling of the house's foundation. But Elias wasn't an ordinary man. He was a sonar man at heart. He felt the vibration in his teeth, a low-frequency resonance that didn't match the ambient noise of the suburb. He lay perfectly still, closing his eyes, letting his senses expand. He pressed his hand against the cold concrete of the garage floor. Thrum, thrum, pause, thrum. It was rhythmic, mechanical, and it was deep. He sat up, wiping grease from his hands with a rag. He looked around the garage. The air compressor was off. The refrigerator in the corner was silent. The neighborhood outside was still. He walked to the workbench and picked up a glass of water he'd left there. He placed it on the floor, right in the center of the bay where the car usually sat. He watched the surface of the water, ripples, tiny concentric circles expanding from the center, disrupting the reflection of the overhead fluorescent light. Industrial machinery, he whispered to himself. But that made no sense. This was a residential zone. The nearest construction site was 3 miles away near the Tyson's Corner shopping mall. Heavy machinery didn't transmit vibration this far through the dense Virginia clay unless it was directly underneath him. Elias spent the next 3 days mapping the floor. He used a mechanic's stethoscope, pressing the diaphragm against the concrete at 2-foot intervals, marking the intensity of the hum with chalk. By Tuesday evening, his garage floor looked like a tactical map. The center of the disturbance wasn't random. It followed a linear path, running north-northeast to south-southwest, cutting diagonally across his property line. He went to the county records office the next morning, pulling the original blueprints of the subdivision and the sewage and utility maps. He told the clerk he was planning to install a hydraulic lift and needed to check for pipes. The maps showed the standard array of suburban infrastructure: water mains 6 feet down, sewage lines at 8 feet, gas lines at 4. Nothing was listed below 10 feet, but the hum was coming from much deeper. Based on the dissipation of the wave, Elias calculated the source was at least 70 or 80 feet down. That night, the paranoia that had kept him alive in the Barents Sea began to creep into his comfortable retirement. He sat in his study, looking out the window at the dark street. A blue sedan drove by slowly. It was probably just a neighbor coming home late, but Elias noted the time, 11:42 p.m. Why would someone be operating heavy machinery 80 feet underground in the middle of the night? He knew he couldn't call the police. "Officer, my floor is humming," would get him a patronizing pat on the back and a referral to a psychiatrist. He couldn't call his old contacts at the Office of Naval Intelligence. He'd been out of the loop for 3 years, and cold calling the Pentagon about underground noises was a good way to lose his security clearance pension benefits. He had to be sure. Elias went back to the garage and looked at the chalk lines. He needed to see what was down there. He didn't have a drilling rig, but he had time, and he had ingenuity. He began to construct a plan. He would tell his wife, Martha, that he was installing a deep anchor drainage system for the garage to prevent flooding, a plausible lie given the heavy rains that spring. He rented a heavy-duty concrete coring saw and a tripod-mounted auger from a supply shop in Falls Church. He paid in cash. On Friday morning, bringing the same focus he once used to track Alpha-class submarines, Elias Thorne broke ground. He cut a neat 12-inch circle in the center of the garage floor. He lifted the concrete plug, revealing the damp red clay of Virginia. He started digging. The digging was slow, back-breaking work, but Elias treated it like a mission. He wasn't trying to dig a man-sized hole. That would take months. He was drilling a probe shaft, a narrow bore just wide enough to drop a sensor package down. He modified the auger, welding extension rods from steel piping he bought at 3 different hardware stores to avoid suspicion. He created a slurry system to wash the mud out of the hole, pumping it into the backyard garden, where he mixed it with mulch. 10 feet, 20 feet, 30. The work consumed him. He stopped sensing the vibration with his hands and started feeling it in his bones. The closer he got, the more distinct the sound became. It wasn't just a hum anymore. It was a ventilation cycle. Whir, click, whoosh. At 40 feet, he hit a layer of rock. It took him 2 days and 3 diamond-tipped bits to break through. Martha brought him sandwiches in the garage, watching him with a mix of amusement and concern. "You're going to strike oil, Eli," she joked, leaning against the doorframe. "Then we can move to Texas." "Just drainage, Marty," he said, forcing a smile. He hated lying to her. In 20 years of marriage, she had been the only person he completely trusted. But the habits of the silent service were hard to break. Need to know. And until he knew what was down there, she didn't need to know. At 65 feet, the soil composition changed. The red clay gave way to a gray, sandy mixture that didn't look natural. It was fill dirt. Someone had dug here before, and they had backfilled the void. On the 5th day, at a depth of 78 feet, the auger hit something hard. It wasn't rock. The sound was different. When rock is struck, it crunches or chips. This was a dull thud, followed by a high-pitched scrape of metal on concrete. Elias pulled the drill string up, dismantling it section by section. When he examined the tip of the bit, he found traces of gray dust. Concrete. High-grade, reinforced concrete. He switched to a masonry bit and lowered the string again. He drilled slowly, inch by inch. After 8 inches of resistance, the drill suddenly punched through. It spun freely. The resistance was gone. He had hit a void. Elias cut the power to the drill. Silence rushed back into the garage, but now, rushing up from the narrow pipe he had sunk into the earth, there was a sound, a faint, distant movement of air. He pulled the drill out. He knelt over the hole, putting his ear to the opening. He could hear it clearly now. A low, electrical hum. The faint, rhythmic cycling of air scrubbers. And something else. The sound of a door closing. Elias sat back on his heels, his heart hammering against his ribs. There was a structure 80 feet below his suburban home. A structure with power, ventilation, and people. He needed eyes. Over the next 24 hours, Elias cannibalized every piece of electronics he owned. He took a fiber optic inspection camera he used for the car engine, but the cable was too short. He spliced it with coaxial cable, boosting the signal with a scavenged amplifier from an old ham radio setup. He rigged a small, high-intensity halogen bulb to the tip of the probe. He waited until 3 a.m. Martha was asleep. The street was dead. He lowered the probe down the shaft. He watched the grainy black-and-white monitor he had set up on his workbench. 10 feet, damp earth. 40 feet, the jagged edge of the rock layer. 70 feet, the sandy fill dirt. 78 feet, the clean, bored hole through the concrete roof. The camera popped through the ceiling of the structure. Elias adjusted the focus. The halogen light cut through the darkness, illuminating a space that shouldn't have existed. It wasn't a cave. It was a corridor. The walls were lined with prefabricated concrete segments, bolted together with heavy steel flanges. Along the left wall, thick bundles of black cables ran in parallel lines, secured with industrial brackets. On the right wall, there were ventilation ducts. The floor was metal grating. It looked like the utility tunnels beneath the Pentagon or the secure bunkers at Mount Weather. But it was narrower, more utilitarian. Elias rotated the cable, spinning the camera. About 10 feet down the tunnel from his entry point, there was a junction box on the wall. It was a heavy gray metal cabinet. He zoomed in as best he could. There was writing stenciled on the box in faded red paint. Elias squinted at the grainy screen. He expected to see high voltage, or Bell Atlantic, or DoD property. Instead, he saw characters that made his blood run cold. Opasno, Wysokoe napряжение Cyrillic. Opasno, Wysokoe napряжение. Danger, high voltage. Elias stared at the screen, the translation automatic in his mind. He had spent years studying Russian naval manuals, intercepting Soviet comms. There was a Soviet tunnel beneath McLean, Virginia. The realization didn't bring panic. It brought a cold, crystalline focus. This was an invasion. It was a physical breach of the homeland. The Cold War wasn't just a geopolitical standoff anymore. It was literally under his feet. Elias knew the geography of the area. His house sat on a vector between the Soviet embassy on Tunlaw Road and the CIA headquarters at Langley. But the tunnel wasn't heading toward the CIA. Based on the angle, it was running parallel to the Potomac, heading toward the telecommunications trunk lines that served the northern tier of the Pentagon's satellite offices. They weren't moving troops, they were moving information. He had to go down there. The probe wasn't enough. He needed to know if the tunnel was manned, if it was booby-trapped, and exactly what they were tapping. But how? He couldn't widen the 12-inch hole without bringing in heavy machinery that would alert the entire neighborhood, and whoever was listening down there. He went back to the blueprints. The tunnel was 80 feet down. If it was a linear excavation, it had to have ventilation shafts. You couldn't run a tunnel that deep without air exchange. He spent the next day walking the neighborhood. He looked for anomalies. A utility shed that hummed too loudly. A manhole cover that didn't look like the standard county issue. He found it in the wooded buffer zone behind the cul-de-sac, about 200 yards from his backyard. It was a concrete drainage culvert that emptied into a small creek. But the culvert was dry, despite the recent rain. Elias climbed down into the creek bed. He shined his flashlight into the culvert. It went back about 20 feet and ended in a steel grate. He approached the grate. It wasn't welded shut. It was hinged, and the lock on it wasn't a standard master lock. It was a heavy-duty, sophisticated mechanism, but the shackle showed signs of recent oiling. This was the back door. He waited for nightfall. He dressed in dark coveralls, wearing gloves and soft-soled boots. He took a crowbar, a flashlight with a red lens filter to preserve night vision, and his service pistol, a Colt M1911 that he had kept oiled and wrapped in a cloth in his bedside drawer. He told Martha he was going to a late movie to clear his head. She didn't believe him, he could tell, but she didn't stop him. At 11 p.m., Elias slipped into the woods. He reached the culvert and moved to the grate. He didn't try to pick the lock. Instead, he used the crowbar to attack the hinges. The metal groaned, a sound that seemed deafening in the quiet woods, but the rust gave way. He swung the grate open. Behind it was a narrow service ladder leading down into the dark. The air that rushed up smelled of ozone, damp concrete, and stale cigarettes. Soviet cigarettes. Belomorkanal. He recognized the harsh, acrid scent from intelligence briefings. He began the climb. The ladder was endless, rung after rung, descending into the belly of the earth. He counted them, 100, 120. He reached the bottom. He was in a small vestibule, a transition chamber. A heavy steel blast door stood in front of him. It was unlatched, slightly ajar. Elias drew his weapon. He pushed the door open with his foot. He stepped into the tunnel he had seen on the screen. In person, it was even more oppressive. The ceiling was low, forcing him to hunch slightly. The lights were dim, caged bulbs spaced 50 feet apart. casting long, skeletal shadows against the ribbed walls. The hum was louder here, a physical vibration that rattled his teeth. He moved forward, stepping on the balls of his feet. He checked for tripwires, for pressure plates. The Soviets were masters of denial and destruction. If this place was compromised, it was likely rigged to blow. He walked for 10 minutes, covering perhaps a quarter of a mile. The tunnel curved gently to the east. Then the tunnel widened. He came to a station. It wasn't just a conduit anymore. The tunnel opened up into a prefabricated room, about 20 feet by 20 feet. The walls were covered in soundproofing foam. In the center of the room sat a bank of electronic equipment that looked like the bridge of a spaceship. Oscilloscopes, reel-to-reel tape recorders, spectrum analyzers. Green phosphor screens glowed in the dim light, displaying jagged waveforms. And sitting in a chair, his back to Elias, was a man. He was wearing headphones. He was smoking. A distinct cloud of blue smoke drifted up toward the ventilation duct. Elias raised his 1911, aiming at the center of the man's back. "Don't move," Elias said, his voice a low command deck growl. The man didn't jump. He didn't reach for a weapon. He simply reached up, slowly, and pulled the headphones down around his neck. He turned the chair around. He was young, maybe 30. He had the pale, pasty complexion of someone who lived underground. He wore a gray technician's jumpsuit with no insignia. He looked at Elias, then at the gun, then back at Elias's face. "You are late," the man said. His English was perfect, accented only slightly. Shift change was supposed to be an hour ago. Then he realized Elias wasn't wearing a jumpsuit. He realized Elias was holding an American service pistol. The man's eyes went wide. "Who are you?" the Russian whispered. "I'm the landlord," Elias said, "and you're behind on the rent." The Russian technician, whose name turned out to be Yuri, was not a soldier. He was a specialist from the GRU, the Soviet military intelligence. He froze, his hands trembling as he held them up. "Please," Yuri said, "do not shoot. I am unarmed. I am an engineer." Elias kept the gun trained on him. "Stand up, slowly. Hands behind your head." Yuri complied. Elias patted him down quickly. No weapons. Just a pack of cigarettes, a lighter, and a small notebook. Elias shoved the man against the console. "What is this?" Elias demanded, gesturing to the wall of electronics. "What are you tapping?" Yuri remained silent, his jaw set. He was terrified, but he was disciplined. Elias stepped closer, pressing the barrel of the Colt into the small of the man's back. "I was a submarine commander, son. I know what a passive sonar array looks like. I know what an intercept station looks like. You're tapping a trunk line. Which one?" Yuri swallowed hard. I cannot say." Elias glanced at the equipment. He recognized the markings on the main cable housing. It was a splice, a parasitic tap attached to a massive, lead-shielded cable running through the floor of the chamber. "That's a Bell system hardened line," Elias noted. "That's the red trunk, the direct link between the Naval Observatory and the Pentagon." Yuri didn't answer, but his eyes darted to the tape recorders. The reels were spinning slowly, capturing every impulse traveling through the cable. Elias looked at the monitors. They weren't just recording voice, they were recording data. High-speed encrypted data bursts. "You're not just listening," Elias realized. "You're injecting." He looked at a keyboard sitting on the console. It was connected to a signal generator. "You're feeding false data into the naval loop," Elias said, his voice dropping. This was catastrophic. If they could alter the navigation data or the readiness reports flowing into the Pentagon, they could manipulate American fleet movements. They could create phantom submarines, hide real ones, or trigger a false alarm that could start World War III. "It is automated," Yuri stammered. "I just monitor the signal quality. I do not know the content." "Where are the others?" Elias asked. "Shift change," Yuri said. "They come soon. 20 minutes. Elias checked his watch. He had 20 minutes before a squad of KGB security or a relief crew showed up. He couldn't fight a squad. He needed to disable this place and get out. But he couldn't just smash the machines. If he did, the Soviets would know the tap was blown. They would disappear, collapse the tunnel, and start somewhere else. He needed to prove this existed. He needed evidence. "Turn it off," Elias ordered. "I cannot," Yuri said. "If I cut the power, the impedance on the line changes. The Americans will detect the fault. The system is designed to be invisible." "Then give me the tape," Elias said. "The one recording right now." Yuri hesitated. Elias thumbed the hammer of the Colt. The click echoed loudly in the small room. Yuri reached over and stopped the reel-to-reel. He unspooled the magnetic tape and handed it to Elias. "Move," Elias said. "We're leaving." "Leaving?" Yuri asked. "I cannot leave. They will kill me. If you stay here when they find out an American was here, they'll kill you anyway to plug the leak," Elias said. "Your only chance is to walk out of here with me." Yuri looked at the dark tunnel leading back toward the culvert, then at the secure phone on the desk that connected him to his superiors. He made his choice. He stepped away from the console. "Wait," Yuri said. He grabbed the notebook from the desk. "You will need this. The cipher keys." Elias took the notebook. He shoved the tape into his coveralls. "Let's go." They moved back into the tunnel. Elias kept Yuri in front of him. They walked fast, the sound of their footsteps swallowed by the hum of the ventilation. They were halfway back to the ladder when the lights in the tunnel flickered. The hum of the ventilation fans changed pitch. It went from a steady drone to a high-pitched whine. "They are here," Yuri whispered, stopping dead. "They are cycling the airlock." "Which end?" "The main entrance," Yuri said. "Under the garage." "My garage?" Elias asked, confused. "No, I drilled through the garage." "There's no entrance there." Yuri shook his head. "Not your garage, the safe house. The house at the end of the block, the blue house." Elias froze. The blue house. The house with the perfectly manicured lawn, where the neighbors, the Millers, lived. They were a quiet couple. He worked in import-export. "The Millers are Soviet agents?" "I do not know names," Yuri said. "I know Sector 4 entry point." The lights flickered again, and then went out completely. The tunnel was plunged into absolute darkness. "They cut the power," Yuri hissed. "They know the tape stopped. The telemetry alarm triggered." Elias grabbed Yuri's shoulder. "Keep moving. I have a light." He clicked on the red lens flashlight. The beam cut a narrow cone through the gloom. "Run," Elias said. They ran. The metal grating clanged under their boots. Elias could hear shouting behind them now. Distant, echoing voices bouncing off the concrete walls. Russian voices. Angry. "Blocking team!" Yuri shouted as they ran. "They will seal the bulkhead!" "The blast door at the ladder?" "Yes. If they seal it, we are trapped." Elias pushed himself harder. He was fit for a 50-year-old, but the air in the tunnel was getting thin. The ventilation had stopped. They reached the vestibule at the base of the ladder. The heavy steel door was beginning to swing shut. An electric motor whined, driving the locking pins. "Go!" Elias shouted. He shoved Yuri toward the gap. Yuri squeezed through. Elias threw himself after him, diving through the narrowing opening, just as the heavy steel slabs slammed into the frame. Clang! The sound was deafening. The locking bolts engaged with a mechanical thud. They were on the ladder side, but they weren't safe yet. The Soviets would have override codes, or they would come to the surface entrance at the culvert. "Up," Elias commanded. They scrambled up the ladder. The climb was grueling. Yuri was panting, his terror fueling his speed. Elias was right behind him, pistol drawn, listening for the sound of the door opening below them. They reached the top. The night air rushed in through the open grate. Elias pushed Yuri out into the creek bed. He climbed out after him and slammed the grate shut. He tried to jam the mechanism with the crowbar, bending the metal to make it harder to open from the inside. "Where do we go?" Yuri asked, looking around the dark woods. "They have watchers. The neighborhood is monitored." Elias looked toward his house. It was 200 yards away through the trees. "We go to my house," Elias said. "I have a secure line. I can call the Pentagon." "No." Yuri grabbed his arm. "You do not understand. The tap, it listens to the Pentagon, but the Millers, they have people inside." "Inside the Pentagon?" "Inside the response teams," Yuri said. "If you call the police or the FBI field office, the notification goes to the watch commander. If the watch commander is one of ours, They send a cleanup crew, not a rescue team. Elias stared at the Russian. The infiltration was that deep. It sounded impossible. But looking at the tunnel, looking at the complexity of the operation, he couldn't dismiss it. Then who do I trust? Elias asked. No one, Yuri said. Do you have a gun? A bigger one? I have a shotgun in the safe. Get it, Yuri said. Because they are coming. As if on cue, a floodlight snapped on in the backyard of the blue house down the street. A garage door opened. Elias saw silhouettes moving across the lawn. They weren't moving like suburban neighbors. They were moving like a Spetsnaz fire team. They were spreading out, sweeping toward the woods. They're tracking us, Elias said. Thermal? Maybe, Yuri said. Or they just know where the exit is. My car, Elias said. The garage. Your garage has a hole in the floor, Yuri pointed out. It also has the Austin Healey, Elias said. And it's not electronic. It has no chips they can track. They crouched low, moving through the underbrush, circling back toward Elias's property. They had to cross 2 backyards. A dog barked in the distance. They reached Elias's fence. He vaulted over, adrenaline masking the ache in his joints. Yuri followed. They burst into the side door of the garage. The garage was exactly as Elias had left it. The hole in the floor was dark. The drill rig stood silent. Get in the car, Elias ordered. He threw the tape and the notebook onto the passenger seat. This is small, Yuri said, looking at the tiny British convertible. It's fast, Elias said. He jumped into the driver's seat. He turned the key. The inline-6 engine roared to life, the custom exhaust echoing in the enclosed space. Elias hit the garage door opener. The door began to roll up. As the door rose, revealing the driveway, Elias saw them. 2 men in dark windbreakers standing at the end of his driveway. They held suppressed submachine guns. Down! Elias shouted. He dropped the clutch and slammed the accelerator. The Healey tires smoked on the concrete, catching traction. The car shot forward. Glass shattered as bullets raked the windshield. Yuri screamed, curling into a ball in the passenger footwell. Elias ducked low, steering by instinct. He clipped the side of the mailbox, sending it spinning into the air. He fishtailed onto the street, the rear end swinging wide. More shots. He heard the thwack-thwack of rounds hitting the trunk lid. He shifted into second gear, the engine screaming. He sped down the quiet suburban street, blowing through the stop sign at the corner. He checked the rearview mirror. Headlights. A black sedan peeled out of the Miller's driveway, tires screeching. Hold on, Ivan! Elias yelled over the wind rushing through the broken windshield. We're going to see how well you handle American cornering. Elias drove like a madman, weaving through the winding streets of McLean. He knew these roads. He knew every pothole, every hidden driveway. The black sedan behind them was heavy, powerful, likely an American muscle car or a modified Mercedes, but the Healey was nimble. Where are we going? Yuri yelled, his face pale, clutching the dashboard. We need a safe harbor, Elias shouted back. I can't go to the police station. They'll intercept us before we get to the lobby. The embassy? Yuri suggested sarcastically. Funny. Elias's mind raced. He needed someone with clearance, someone with firepower, and someone who wasn't in the standard chain of command. He thought of Admiral Vance. The Bull. Vance was retired too, living in a sprawling estate in Middleburg, about 40 minutes west. Vance had been the chief of naval operations. He was a paranoid old bastard who hated the Soviets with a biblical intensity. He also kept a private arsenal and had a personal security detail of former SEALs. We're going to the country, Elias said. He swung the car onto Route 123, heading toward the George Washington Parkway. If he could get to the highway, he could open the engine up. The sedan was closing the gap. Elias saw the muzzle flash from the passenger window. A bullet sparked off the asphalt next to his rear tire. They're shooting to kill, Yuri screamed. They're shooting to stop the car, Elias corrected. If they wanted us dead, they'd use a rocket. They want the tape back. Elias yanked the wheel, taking a hard right onto a narrow access road that led to the Potomac River parks. This is a dead end, Yuri cried. It's a shortcut, Elias said. Trust the Navy. The road turned into gravel. The Healey bounced violently. The heavy sedan behind them bottomed out, sparks flying from its undercarriage, but it kept coming. Elias saw the chain-link fence ahead. It was a maintenance gate for the Park Service. "Brace yourself." He didn't brake. He hit the gate at 50 miles per hour. The chain link snapped, the metal poles tearing out of the ground. The windshield finally shattered completely, showering them in safety glass. They skidded onto the bike path running parallel to the river. "This is insane," Yuri yelled. "It's tactical evasion," Elias grunted. He struggled to keep the lightweight car on the narrow asphalt path. To their right, the Potomac River flowed black and cold. To their left, the dense woods. The sedan couldn't fit. Elias saw it in the mirror, slamming on its brakes, skidding into the trees. They were clear. For now. Elias drove for another 2 miles on the bike path before cutting across a field and merging onto the Chain Bridge Road. He slowed down, blending into the light late-night traffic. He glanced at Yuri. The Russian was shaking, picking glass out of his hair. "You drive well for an old man," Yuri muttered. "And you scream loud for a spy," Elias retorted. He looked at the tape sitting on the seat between them. That spool of magnetic tape was the most dangerous object on the planet right now. It contained proof of a compromised national defense network. "What is on the tape, Yuri?" Elias asked, his voice calmer now. "The specific segment I grabbed. What was it?" Yuri hesitated, lighting a cigarette with trembling hands. "It was a voice verification." "Whose voice?" "I do not know the name," Yuri said. "But the tag on the file." The code name was Orion. Elias gripped the steering wheel tighter. Orion. He knew that code name. It was whispered in the corridors of the Pentagon. Orion wasn't a person. It was a program. A deep cover placement program for strategic assets. "The voice," Elias pressed. "Was it American?" "Yes," Yuri said. He was authorizing a bypass of the DEFCON alert safeguards. The gravity of it hit Elias like a depth charge. They weren't just listening. They were preparing to blind the U.S. early warning system. "We need to get to Admiral Vance," Elias said. "We need to wake him up." They sped west into the darkness of the Virginia countryside, leaving the city behind. But Elias knew the tunnel was still there, humming in the dark beneath his home, a loaded gun pointed at the heart of America.